Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Ashanti Jones from SchoolHouse Connection. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on student homelessness and what Californians can do about it. So SchoolHouse Connection, right? We are a national organization that really works to overcome homelessness through education. We provide strategic advocacy and practical assistance in partnership with schools, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, service providers, families, and young people who themselves have been impacted by homelessness. And my name is Ashanti Jones. I serve as a senior policy and advocacy manager here at SchoolHouse Connection. And a lot of the work that we do can be found on our website, schoolhouseconnection.org. And if you ever have any questions around the state or federal advocacy that we do, you can send us a question at info@schoolhouseconnection.org, where we actually do answer those questions and place them on the website. We also host a series of webinars similar to the one that you're attending today, and various other implementation tools to help you replicate and support the advocacy that we employ with our state partners. And we also host a youth leadership and scholarship program, as well as a policy core program that really activates the advocacy of young people who have an interest in policy and advocacy, but also have been personally impacted by these issues. And so again, thank you so much for joining us today. One of the programs that we do run is our Policy Fellows program. And so the Policy Fellows program is the thing that has brought us all together tonight. The aim of the Policy Fellow program is to really connect and mobilize a network of allies and advocates that are located across a variety of states that can respond to calls of action around legislative advocacy at both the federal and state levels. And so this can include putting together sign-on letters and encouraging legislators to sign on to those letters, hosting lobbying meetings with congressional representatives to support certain legislation. It also looks like what we're doing here tonight, providing this community engagement to ensure that people who have the power locally to implement some of these advocacy tools have all the information that they need to be active partners in advocacy. And so joining us tonight, we actually have two of California's Policy Fellows tonight. First, we have Cecilia Eggleston, who I'll now turn over and give a few moments to introduce herself.
Hi, yes, so I'm Cecilia. I'm originally from Eureka, California, but I'm now currently in Los Angeles at UCLA. I'm a third-year molecular bio student at UCLA. I've been involved with SchoolHouse since 2020 when I was part of their youth leadership program, and then have continued on with this Policy Fellows. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cece. It's really great to have you in the fold. You've been an instrumental piece of the legislative work that we are doing. I also really like to introduce Jennifer Kotke, who is also a Policy Fellow in California. A few moments to introduce yourself.
Yes, good evening. I'm Dr. Jennifer Kotke. I'm the Homeless Education Project Director here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. And I have been doing this work in some capacity over about the last 22, 23 years. So very excited to be here and to really just remind us of just a lot of different ways we can get involved. So thank you for having me.
No worries. Thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate the effort and support of both you and Cece. And so today, after we've welcomed you, we're now going to jump into introduction to student homelessness to give everyone a sense of how pervasive the issue is. And then we'll talk a little bit about things that you can do to support the work of Jennifer and Cece and SchoolHouse Connection in California. And so first, one thing that we know is that sometimes we think about homelessness in a single way, right? Sometimes we think homelessness just means refers to people who are openly living on the streets, and we see that, right? We see that, you know, they're homeless and they're living on the street. However, that is not the only way that homelessness presents. And so we wanted to share just a bit of information about all of the various different ways that homelessness becomes hidden, right? And so young people who are staying in motels, whether it's paid for with cash by the family or a charitable organization, that's homelessness, right? Staying with other people following an eviction or any other kind of economic hardship, also homelessness. Having to relocate and staying in a domestic violence shelter due to some type of abuse or any other type of shelter is also a form of homelessness. Couch surfing, not necessarily having a stable and secure place to live, maybe staying with friends or other family members, that is also homelessness. And then lastly, we have living doubled up. So when you have multiple families living in dwellings that are not necessarily slated for, that many people to be living together, living doubled up or living tripled up is also a form of homelessness. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cece and Jennifer. You can feel free to hop in where it fits to talk through a little bit about how this issue presents itself in California specifically.
Yeah, I can start. So I can talk about a bit about my experience. So yeah, I fall into this category of like the doubled up category, which is what I found is like the majority of the cases of like youth homelessness. And I think an issue with the doubled up category is a lot of people there's a lot of misconceptions about homelessness. So I didn't know that I was considered experiencing homelessness. I just thought I was in like an atypical living situation. But if we do look in California, this 270,000 youth experiencing homelessness is a huge number. And likely that number is probably underestimated because so many students don't get identified because they don't know themselves or because the school doesn't have the facilities in place to be properly like identifying and doing outreach with students.
And this, go ahead, Cece.
Oh, sorry. And if we just looking, specifically in LA County alone, 51,000 students is like a staggering number.
So Jennifer, do you want to hop in just to talk a little bit about these statistics at all?
Yeah, we do have a very high count, and it's a very interesting number for our annual count this year. One of the things that we do know is that we have actually had a lot of students migrate out of our area, our county, as well as our state, sometimes even our country to back to home countries. And so what we have found is that even though the number seems, and for us, honestly, it's dropped over the last couple of years. I would say about 2 or 3 years ago, we were sitting more at like 63,000 or 67,000 students identified. So the past 2 years, we've found ourselves more in the 50s. But one of the things that has been, and particularly this past year, has been poignant is that we have lost so many students, and yet our number has remained the same. And so I think that's an important takeaway, is that there is an increase. It's just hard to gauge because we've lost so many students out of our area. And I do emphasize there is a huge amount of underreporting, as Cece had mentioned, whether a family or a student doesn't recognize themselves as being homeless. We also have a lot of issues with families not wanting to identify for multiple reasons, and that's very valid here in the state of California, especially related to immigrant and undocumented related concerns.
So thank you so much for that context that you provided, both Cece and Jennifer, because that has such implications, high implications for the impact of homelessness on education, right? And so 42% of students who have experienced homelessness do say that they dropped out at least one time. 60% of those students say that it was hard to stay in school while they were homeless for very obvious reasons when you have so many other things going on, including having to figure out where you're going to sleep that night. It's very difficult to stay focused on being on time, present, and actively engaged in school. It's also important to note that homelessness in itself is associated with an 87% likelihood of dropping out, being chronically absent, and being subject to disproportionate school discipline, all things which have serious implications for school completion, graduation, and post-secondary attainment. And so what we see is that over time, the achievement gaps that occur between young people who are homeless and other low-income elementary students tends to persist and worsen over time. And so the reason why having a high school diploma in itself is just so important is for very, very obvious reason, right? One, not only does more than two-thirds of jobs require some form of post-secondary education, which you can't get without a high school diploma or a GED, the implications for not having a high school diploma or GED is significantly tied to a young person experiencing homelessness as a young adult. Young people who without a GED or a high school diploma are 346% more likely to experience homelessness as a young adult. And so the McKinney-Vento Act is one of the most important strategies to help overcome homelessness. And that's even more important during the pandemic. And the McKinney-Vento Act in itself helps support young people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk for homelessness, because it helps keep students in their school of origin. So even when they are transient, maybe couch surfing or living doubled up or have to keep moving around, they're able to still attend the same school, which helps with educational disruption, right? We will know that the students who are experiencing homelessness will have access to the same liaisons, the same teachers, people who know their situations and can support them to and through graduation. It also supports with providing students with transportation. So again, with the transient nature, that support that comes with homelessness and being homeless, young people can still be bused or be provided another form of transportation to make sure that they can get to school. And if they do have to switch school districts, they're able to be immediately enrolled into the next school district. So there isn't any disruption in the continuity of their education. And it also supports with assisting students through graduation and beyond. And so the definition of homeless, when we're talking about eligibility for McKinney-Vento services, we're talking about children and young people who lack a very fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so this includes young people who share the housing of others due to the loss of housing, economic hardship, or any other similar reason. This also includes young people who live in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds, due to lack of any other adequate accommodation. And so sharing housing, 77% of identified McKinney-Vento students in 2020 were sharing housing. 8% of them were living in motels. And then you have young people who are living in emergency or transitional shelters. Around 11% of students who are identified under McKinney-Vento fell into that category. And then you also have young people who either live in a public or private place that's not necessarily designated as accommodations, like living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, any kind of substandard housing, train stations, or anything that kind of falls within that realm. And there is U.S. Department of Education guidance on this. And so I am going to stop here just to one flag that we do have both the chat box and the Q&A open. So if there's anything that you have a question on, or just a comment or feedback on, you can utilize those two features to just maintain engagement in the conversation. And so we'll stop pretty frequently to gauge questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll also give a few minutes at the end for that as well. So feel free to engage in that way. And one last thing that I wanted to flag before I moved on was the number of young people who are experiencing homelessness nationwide. And so Jennifer and Cece mentioned something very, very important. And they talked about how difficult it was to keep students or retain students, right? And so that loss of students, whether that loss was classified by, moving out of district or, or somewhere else, or maybe just not re-identifying, that number is reflected in how many young people are experiencing homelessness. So currently there are about 1.1 million young people who are experiencing homelessness nationwide. Right. A few years ago, before the pandemic, the number was around 1.4 million. And so that is a clear indicator that no, homelessness is not necessarily going away or being fixed, but the maintaining contact with families and keeping and retaining students has been difficult given the pandemic, which has been difficult on all of us. So only imagine those who have had issues with their housing. And so I'm going to move our conversation to the legislative advocacy piece. And so one piece of our Policy Fellows program has been about hosting congressional visits, right? Talking to our legislators and our representatives about these issues and ways in which they can support. And so I want to leave a few minutes before I actually hop into the nuts and bolts of things for Jennifer and Cece to provide feedback on how those congressional visits went. How did you feel about them, and kind of what did you experience?
Yeah, I can start. So I found them to be very, very valuable. I think there's a very big difference between what the law says or what the statistics say about the issues and like the real life stories of these issues. I found, for example, with McKinney-Vento, is like, yes, all those protections do exist, but in my case, I didn't receive any of them because I never had contact with my homeless liaison, even though I had been identified. And I think having those congressional visits, like I think being able to provide story-driven information is much more valuable in terms of advocacy, in terms of actually pinpointing, what needs to be supported and what, how the law is actually applied.
Do you have anything to add, Jen?
Yeah, we met with the field worker that was working with our particular, I believe it was one of our senators or representatives. For me, it's really about sharing what's happening in the field and what's really happening when the rubber meets the road in the field. And so often I think there is a disconnect between the legislation that's being created and what's actually going on in the world. And so I know Cece and I were in one of those meetings together, and I have always advocated for the actual voices of youth in those conversations, because I think they speak so much more loudly than anything else. They are the ones who have experienced, their life experience speaks to how the law should actually be written, how the law should be implemented. Because that's the ultimate goal here, is to ensure that we are ending or we are mitigating the issues that are happening with our young people. So for me, it's always an incredible experience. I advocate for it by all means. As I mentioned, we were recently at NACI. There's always kind of this fine dance of what county office and district people can do when it comes to advocacy with legislators, but at the same time, it's important to, as long as you can get a team around you of those who you work for and they're receptive to you having those conversations, I would encourage you to go for it. So
thank you so much for that feedback, Jen and Cece. So congressional visits are super important, and they are looped into the Policy Fellows program because that's how you move things, right? This legislative advocacy is how you get your voice heard. It is how you advocate for those who are experiencing these issues, and it's how we make meaningful change. And so in the 117th Congress, that's our current Congress, in the House, we have a pretty tight, Democrat-Republican split. And so even though the Democrats do control the White House, House, and Senate, they do have the power to set the policy agendas. It is really important that we try to do bipartisan engagement. And because the Senate is 50-50 split, right? So there's really a toss-up on how things can go. And so you can get something through the House, but without that bipartisan support right now, and getting both Republicans and Democrats really involved and engaged with these legislative reforms, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get things passed. And so those bipartisan efforts were something that we really plugged into our Policy Fellows program. And so the three things that we've been advocating for and that we're going to encourage all of you to look into and advocate for have been these three legislative priorities for homeless children, youth, and families. Foster youth and families. Okay, and so first has been flexible funding to support homeless children and youth. The second is removing barriers to higher education for homeless and foster youth. And the third is the Homeless Children and Youth Act. And so now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into each of these priority areas so we can understand what we're talking about here. And so as I do that, feel free again to use the Q&A and the chat feature just to ask any questions, whether they're clarifying or probing, whatever is on your heart. And we'll answer those as we move along. And so first, flexible funding for students experiencing homelessness is us basically advocating for $800 million in flexible funding to be the annual EHCY appropriations level moving forward. And the reason why that's so important is because we have to sustain the American Rescue Plan Homeless Children and Youth Program. And so the reason why the American Rescue Plan funds is what's being advocated for is because that $800 million was life-changing to most districts. The current appropriation, which is around $100 million, only gives about a quarter of the nation's educational institutions access to actually host, have a liaison, a homeless student liaison, a McKinney-Vento liaison. That's again, 25%, around 24 to 25% of our school districts are actually able to identify, enroll, and support young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so when you have a sustained investment, that's 8 times the annual appropriation, you're actually able to increase the amount of young people that are able to keep in contact with, so we don't continue to lose those students, as Jennifer was lifting up, right? And so that $800 million is more funding than the previous 10 years combined that we've had for this type of programming. And so in order to continue to meet the needs of students experiencing homelessness, especially in this post-pandemic world, where we're not quite out of the woods, right? And people are still reeling from the impacts of it, we have to be diligent and have sustainable funding and programming to support young people. And so let me just check the chat really quickly. Yes. Thank you. Yes, Rod put in the chat that in addition to any questions, we do welcome your feedback on these asks and these things that we're asking for. So if you have any feedback, feel free to put that in the chat or the Q&A as well. Thank you. And the next thing that we were talking about is talking about higher education access and success, right? And so the HCY Act, the super long name here, Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth Act. So HCY is basically requiring the designation of a higher education liaison for homeless and foster youth. And so just how K through 12 school districts can have the McKinney-Vento liaison to support the identification, enrollment, and graduation of young people experiencing homelessness, this kind of allows us at the higher education level do the same thing, right? Because we want our young people to graduate and we want them to go to college if that's in their life plan. But just as we spoke about, there's a strong indicators and connection between high school achievement and young adult homelessness. And so we want to make sure that young people are stable while they're pursuing a post-secondary education and that they can have access to the same types of support that they had or should have had throughout K through 12. It also requires a plan for housing for both during semesters and school breaks, and does places young people as a priority for on-campus housing when they're experiencing homelessness. It also does provide homeless and foster youth in-state tuition. So if they, relocating for school, they'll be able to have the lowest possible tuition available to them to just reduce a few of those barriers that occur when you're experiencing homelessness. And so there's a ton of other things that HCY does. And you will receive a copy of this presentation where you can actually click some of these links. So if you have any questions about okay, what else does HCY do? You can look at this slide and click the link and it should take you right there so you can read the full list of provisions. And then lastly, the Homeless Children and Youth Act, right? And so what this does, it corrects longstanding flaws in eligibility requirements for HUD, right? Access to HUD assistance, like homeless assistance, has been limited, mostly due to definitions, right? And so what the Homeless Children and Youth Act would do is align the federal definitions of homelessness by amending HUD's definition so that children and youth who are identified by one of 8, right? So it's more expansive and flexible in terms of identification. So if you're identified as being a homeless child or youth, by one of 8 federal programs, including McKinney-Vento liaisons, you'd be eligible for HUD homeless assistance. So this gives us a little bit more flexibility on the federal level to really support young people in being successful. It also does require HUD to honor any local community priorities and needs, and it improves the data collection on homelessness. So again, it's very easy to lose students who are experiencing homelessness. And if we can't keep track of them and understand their outcomes and expand the definition so that more folks know that this means me, we can't, get the funding, we can't get the programming, right? And so what the Homeless Children and Youth Act would do is improve the data collection on homelessness so that we can effectively advocate for all of the provisions that we need to make sure that young people are supported holistically. And so the ask of all of you here today is to urge your representatives and your senators to support these 3 things, right? They should support robust, flexible funding for students who are experiencing homelessness. Also co-sponsor the HCY Act to make sure that higher ed is in line with what we're trying to do with K-12. And also co-sponsor the Homeless Children and Youth Act. And so if you don't know who your representative is, you can always find out at www.house.gov. And I also will be providing you an advocacy toolkit after this presentation, where you can actually figure out how to talk to these folks, right? Learn how to identify them, and we'll give you some guidance on how to urge your representatives and senators to support these things. Okay, and so I'll stop here again for any last minute questions or feedback. We're really interested in your feedback on anything that we've talked through today, whether it's on the presentation materials or the 3 asks. We do welcome you to do that. And so as you type up, as I'm hoping many of you are, we just want to also say thank you for your time. We do appreciate the fact that all of you took time out of your day to learn about the advocacy efforts of your state's fellows and SchoolHouse Connection, and to learn a little bit more about what you can do. Okay, and so after we end this presentation, we do not want that to be the last time we hear from you, right? We really thank you for coming to the webinar, but there are many ways to maintain connection to both the issues and SchoolHouse Connection. And so these are some of the ways that you can do that. The first way is just to see if your member has signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill. You can go to congress.gov and either type in the bill number or the name of the legislation, and then you can find out who the sponsors are, and you can just kind of, see if your representative has done that. You can also check your members' social media, right? Look to see if they're tweeting about the issue, if they're writing about it on LinkedIn or Facebook. And then you can also just, also tweet at them to say, hey, look, I really encourage you to support these 3 things, right? You can also sign up for SchoolHouse Connections e-newsletter, which goes out pretty regularly, that keeps us updated on what's happening around the country. So there's always little things that you can say, oh, I really love that Oklahoma has done this, and maybe this is something we can advocate here for in, California. And also to find out different ways that you can get involved. You can also check out SchoolHouse Connections federal policy page, which lets you know a little bit more about what we're doing on the federal level, just to expand access to certain things for people experiencing homelessness. And if you have any other questions or want to maintain connection with us more personally, you can always give me an email at ashanti@schoolhouseconnection.org, or you can email my colleague Rod, who has been doing an awesome job monitoring the chat for us and communicating with you guys there. You can also email him. He's our director of state policy. So he's the go-to guy who's doing some awesome work around the country. And so, yeah, you can always maintain connection with us in these ways. And I think I just saw a question come in that says, do we hold regular advocacy meetings so that we can all work together. So the short answer to that, Donna, is no, we don't hold regular, advocacy meetings. However, we do work with states. A lot of the work that we do is on the state level. So we will come into places like California, and work with groups who care about certain issues and want to pass certain legislation, and we figure it out. We figure it out together, right? We think about what is the issue you're trying to solve and how we can support you in the bill writing and the testimony and legislative advocacy and do that. So if that's something that you're interested in, Donna, you can definitely send us an email and we can figure out what this looks like, what that looks like. We also do regular community of practice work where we do some really, deep dives with certain states on issues that are important to them. And so even though there's not any national or nationwide advocacy meeting that we hold pretty regularly, we are really responsive to any of the needs or issues that you want to bring up to us. So all it takes is an email. You can just communicate with us and we can figure out how we can work together. I hope that was helpful. Awesome. So I actually didn't see any other questions come through. No problem, Donna. Thank you. Come through the chat or the Q&A box. So I will let you all go. I really do appreciate your time once more. And please be on the lookout for an email from me that will give you a copy of this recording, the actual slides, so you can click and look around at some of the things that we've linked here. And an advocacy toolkit that can help you put to action all of the things that we talked about today. And so with that being said, I'd like to encourage all of you to have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful Veterans Day weekend. Thank you and good night.